The old man's truck was the kind of vehicle that told you everything you needed to know about him before he ever opened his mouth. It was a 1994 Ford F-150, faded blue, with a crack running diagonally across the passenger side of the windshield that he'd been meaning to fix since the Clinton administration. The left rear taillight had a strip of red electrical tape over a hairline fracture, not because he couldn't afford a replacement, but because the tape worked, and he saw no reason to spend money solving a problem that was already solved. There was a Veterans of Foreign Wars sticker on the back bumper, small and sun-bleached, the kind that didn't announce anything, just confirmed it. His name was Eugene Alton Mercer. He was 73 years old. He drove with both hands on the wheel at 9 and 3. The way they taught it before power steering made people lazy, and he kept the radio off. He'd driven in silence for so long that the quiet felt like company. He was headed to the Naval Weapons Station at Earle, New Jersey, on a Tuesday morning in late October, and he hadn't wanted to come. That's the part worth understanding first. Eugene Alton Mercer had not volunteered for this. He'd been called. There was a difference, and it was the kind of difference that a man like Eugene understood in his chest, bought before his brain had a chance to weigh in. His former commanding officer, a man named Rear Admiral Philip Stokes, had been the one to call, not through any official channel, but directly on the landline Eugene still kept, because cell phones gave him a head. Stokes had said 3 sentences. "There's something wrong at Earle. I don't know what. I need someone who knows how to look." Eugene had said he'd think about it. Then he'd hung up and sat in his kitchen for 20 minutes, drinking coffee that had gone cold, looking at the window above the sink where his wife used to keep African violets before she passed. Then he'd gotten up, rinsed his cup, and called Stokes back. "I'll come Tuesday," he said. "I'm not wearing a uniform." Stokes hadn't argued. Eugene had spent 31 years in the United States Navy, the last 14 of them in ordnance logistics and weapons storage management. He'd overseen ammunition depots in 3 countries. He'd written protocols that were still in use, though they no longer had his name on them. He'd been at the Earle facility twice before in an official capacity. Once in 1987 and once in 2001, and both times he'd found problems that everyone else had missed. Not because he was smarter than the men and women who worked there. He was careful to understand that. It wasn't about intelligence. It was about years. It was about the particular education that comes from standing in enough storage facilities, in enough climates, through enough seasons, that your body begins to take notes your mind isn't even aware of. He retired in 2008. He'd spent the years since then in a house outside Flemington, New Jersey, working a small vegetable garden in the summer and reading naval history in the winter, and refusing, politely but firmly, every request to consult, advise, lecture, or appear on a panel. He was done with all of that. He wanted to grow tomatoes and be left alone. Then the phone rang. He pulled into the facility at 0845 on a Tuesday. The guard at the main gate was young, couldn't have been more than 22, and he looked at Eugene's visitor credentials with the expression of someone trying to figure out why his grandfather was standing in line at the DMV. "Purpose of visit, sir?" "Ordnance consultation," Eugene said. The guard looked at the credentials again, then at Eugene, then back at the credentials. You're the ordnance consultant? That's what it says." There was a pause. Eugene waited. He was extremely good at waiting. "Go ahead, sir. Building C. They're expecting you." Building C was the administrative hub for the facility's eastern storage cluster. A flat-roofed concrete building that smelled like burned coffee and old carpet, the same in every military installation Eugene had ever visited, as if the Department of Defense had issued a single carpet and a single coffee maker to every base in America sometime around 1978 and simply never replaced either. The officer who met him in the lobby was a lieutenant commander named Brian Tolliver. He was 34 years old, sharp-featured, with the particular posture of someone who had spent considerable time being right and expected to continue doing so. He extended his hand and shook Eugene's with professional warmth. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming." "Sure," Eugene said. "I want to be up front with you," Tolliver said, already walking toward the back corridor. I pushed back on this respectfully. "We've run full diagnostics on the storage units in question. Environmental sensors, structural assessments, the works. Everything came back clean." "Okay," Eugene said. Admiral Stokes insisted. Tolliver didn't say it with hostility exactly. More like a man reading from a balance sheet he disagreed with, but understood he had to present. "So we're happy to do a walkthrough. I just want you to know what we're working with. Eugene nodded. What are the units in question? Cluster 7, magazines 4 through 9. Standard ordnance, 5-inch gun rounds, some older naval mine components that are in staged decommission. Nothing exotic. How old is the oldest material in there? Tolliver hesitated. Some of it goes back to the late 80s. Eugene said nothing. He just kept walking. They suited him up with a hard hat, a safety vest, and a visitor's badge that clipped to his collar, and then Tolliver led him out through the back of Building C, across a gravel access road and into the eastern cluster. The cluster was a series of earthen magazines, spunk-style storage structures built into low berms, their arched roofs covered with compacted soil and grass. Each one had a heavy steel door set into a concrete face, the kind of construction that was meant to contain, not to welcome. There were 2 other staff members with them, a young petty officer named Graves, who was carrying a clipboard and an environmental monitoring kit, and a facilities technician, whose name Eugene didn't catch because the man hadn't offered it and Eugene hadn't asked. The technician was somewhere in his late 20s. He had the look of someone who had been included in this tour against his will. They opened magazine 4 first. Eugene walked in. The air inside was cool and dry, the environmental systems doing their job, the readings on Graves's monitor exactly what they should be. The rounds were stacked on wooden pallets, crated, labelled in good order. Eugene walked the length of the magazine slowly, not rushing, his hands at his sides. He looked at the stacking, the crating condition, the stenciling on the containers. He looked at the floor for moisture intrusion. He looked at the ventilation baffles. Tolliver stood near the entrance watching. They went through magazine 5 the same way, then 6, then 7. Everything was, as Tolliver had said, clean. Magazine 8 was where Eugene stopped moving. He'd taken about 4 steps inside when something changed in his face. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies when the hero suddenly understands everything. It was subtler than that. His chin lifted slightly, his nostrils moved. He stopped walking and stood very still, the way a dog does when it catches a scent on the wind, that particular quality of arrested attention that looks almost like confusion from the outside. Petty Officer Graves, who was walking beside him, noticed first. Mr. Mercer? Something wrong? Eugene didn't answer right away. He took another slow breath through his nose. Then he turned and looked at Tolliver. You smell that? He said, quietly. Not a shout, not an alarm, the kind of voice you use when you're not sure yet and you don't want to be wrong. Tolliver looked at Graves. Graves looked at his monitor. Readings are nominal. Humidity's at 42% temperatures. Not the humidity, Eugene said. There's a smell. The facilities technician near the back made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't quite not one either. Tolliver walked a few steps into the magazine. He breathed in. I don't smell anything. It's faint, Eugene said. Sweet, like. He paused, searching for the right word the way a man does when the word he's looking for isn't in common use. Like overripe fruit, but chemical, like almonds and something else underneath. Graves was looking at his monitor. Sir, honestly, the sensors are not picking up anything. What sensors are these? Eugene asked. Standard environmental suite. Temperature, humidity, particulates, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide. Graves hesitated. The standard suite doesn't include. That's what I thought, Eugene said. He turned to Tolliver. I need everyone out of this magazine. There was a silence that lasted about 3 seconds. In the context of that moment, 3 seconds was a very long time. Mr. Mercer, Tolliver said, and his voice had changed slightly, still professional, but with an edge now, the edge of a man who has been patient and is running short. Our sensors have shown nothing abnormal. This magazine passed inspection 2 weeks ago. The environmental readings right now are completely, Lieutenant Commander. Eugene's voice was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than before. That was the thing about Eugene Alton Mercer, that people who had known him for a long time understood. He did not get louder when he was serious. He got quieter. I am telling you, there is a chemical smell in this magazine that should not be here. I have been in storage facilities like this one since 1977. I know what propellants smell like when they're stable, and I know what they smell like when they are not. I am asking you to get your people out of this space while we figure out what we're dealing with. That's all I'm asking. The technician said, from near the back of the magazine, I've been in here a dozen times this month, and I've never smelled anything. Eugene looked at him. How long have you worked with naval ordnance? The man's jaw shifted. About 18 months. Eugene nodded once. It wasn't condescending, it was just the nod of a man receiving information. "Then you don't know what you're looking for yet," he said. "Not cruelly, just plainly. That's not an insult. It takes time. Out, please." Tolliver stood there for another moment. Eugene could see the calculation happening behind the man's eyes. The weighing of professional credibility against the cost of being wrong. The particular math that people do when someone older and less official tells them something their instruments don't. Then Tolliver made a decision. "Everyone out," he said. "Graves, radio the duty officer." They stood outside Magazine 8 in the cold October air while Graves made his call, and Tolliver stood slightly apart, looking at his phone with the expression of a man composing a message he would rather not have to send. The technician, Eugene learned later his name was Brodie Whitfield, stood with his arms crossed and said nothing. Eugene stood near the magazine door and breathed the outside air and waited. Admiral Stokes arrived 22 minutes later in a government vehicle, followed by a two-person chemical assessment team from the facility's safety office. The assessment team carried equipment Eugene hadn't seen outside of a specialized lab, a photoionization detector, a multi-gas monitor with expanded sensor capability, and what appeared to be a field-portable gas chromatograph. They went into Magazine 8. They came out 11 minutes later. The senior assessor, a civilian woman named Dr. Lena Rios, walked directly to Tolliver. Her face was professionally composed, but her eyes were doing something else. "We have elevated nitrogen dioxide concentrations consistent with advanced propellant decomposition," she said. "We're also getting trace readings of nitroglycerine vapor. Multiple rounds in the rear quadrant of the magazine appear to be an active chemical breakdown." She paused. "At the concentrations we're measuring, sustained exposure over the course of a normal work shift would be acutely hazardous. There's also a non-trivial risk of spontaneous ignition under certain conditions." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Tolliver said, "How did the standard sensors miss this?" "The standard suite isn't calibrated for nitrogen dioxide at these concentration levels," Dr. Rios said. "And nitroglycerin vapor is notoriously difficult to detect with basic environmental monitoring. You'd need purpose-specific equipment." Tolliver turned and looked at Eugene. Eugene was looking at the magazine door. He wasn't looking at Tolliver. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular. He had the expression of a man who is not satisfied about being right, which is a very specific expression and a very rare one. "The sweet smell," Tolliver said. Eugene nodded. "Decomposing nitrocellulose-based propellants, some of those older naval round formulations from the late 80s, if the storage conditions fluctuated over a long enough period, you get autocatalytic decomposition. The byproducts have a distinctive odor. It's in the field manuals. Chapter 4. Most people just..." He paused. "Most people don't read Chapter 4 that carefully." Brodie Whitfield, the technician, had uncrossed his arms. He was looking at the ground. The formal response took the rest of the day. Magazines 5 through 9 were all cleared and reassessed. 2 others showed early-stage decomposition indicators that the standard sensors had also missed. The affected materials were isolated and flagged for emergency disposal review. The facility's inspection protocols were formally suspended pending a comprehensive review of their sensor suite. Admiral Stokes found Eugene at his truck at the end of the afternoon, while the last of the assessment team was loading their equipment into a transport vehicle. "You good?" Stokes asked. "I'm fine," Eugene said. He was pulling off the safety vest, folding it neatly despite the fact that it was government property he'd never see again. "Some habits don't dissolve. I want you to write this up formally. Walk us through what you detected and how. We should be training people on this." Eugene handed the vest to a passing petty officer and turned to look at Stokes. "Philip," he said, "I'm not coming back." Stokes looked at him. "I came because you asked. I'm glad it helped, but I'm not." Eugene stopped and looked out at the tree line to the east of the facility, where the October oaks were holding their last brown leaves against a grey sky. "I'm done with this. I grew tomatoes this summer. Better than any year since '09. I want to go home." Stokes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The tomatoes." "The tomatoes," Eugene confirmed. Stokes smiled, small, tired, the smile of a man who understood the particular arithmetic of what had been said. "The people in that magazine today," he said. "Graves, Whitfield, 3 others on the duty roster for tomorrow morning." Eugene didn't say anything. "They go home tonight," Stokes said. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a manipulation. It was just a fact, stated plainly between 2 men who had spent their careers in the business of understanding what facts cost. Eugene looked at the tree line for another moment. Then he nodded once, the same way he'd nodded inside the magazine, not grandly, not with any performance of emotion. Just a nod. "Get your sensor suite updated," he said. "Photoionization detectors in every magazine. Don't wait on the budget request. Escalate it. I will, and find someone who actually knows ordnance chemistry to rewrite your inspection protocols. Not someone with 18 months of experience. I know, that's all I've got." Eugene opened his truck door. The hinge made the familiar complaint it had been making for 3 years. "Gene," Stokes said. Eugene paused. "Thank you." Eugene got in the truck. He didn't say anything to that. What was there to say? He'd done the thing was done, that was all. He drove north on 34, then west on 195, the way he always came because it was easier than the parkway and he didn't like toll booths. The heater in the truck took about 20 minutes to really get going, so he kept his jacket on and drove in the cold cabin while the engine warmed. He thought about the smell in Magazine 8. He thought about what it must have been like for the ordnance officers who had walked through that magazine over the last several months. The ones who'd had no frame of reference, no accumulated catalogue of smells to cross-reference, no understanding of what early-stage autocatalytic decomposition produces when it starts to work on old propellant. He didn't blame them. How could you smell something you'd never been taught was there? He thought about Chapter 4 of the Field Manual, which he'd first read in 1979, on a base in Norfolk, in a room with 6 other young officers who were all new enough to the work that they still read every chapter carefully. He wondered how many people had skimmed past it since then. Thousands, probably. Most of them fine, some of them lucky. He stopped for gas at a station outside Allentown. While the pump ran, he stood in the cold and watched the traffic on the overpass to the west and thought about nothing in particular, which was the version of rest that worked best for him. He got back in the truck and drove. By the time he got home, it was past 7 and the sky was fully dark. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at the house. The porch light was on. He left it on a timer now because he'd found that coming home to a dark house was a habit of mind he didn't want to keep. Inside, he hung up his jacket on the hook by the door, the same hook where he'd hung every coat since 1991 when he and Helen had moved in, and went to the kitchen and ran water into the kettle. While he waited for it to heat, he stood at the window where the African violets used to be and looked out at the dark garden. He thought about what Stokes had said. They go home tonight. Graves. Whitfield. 3 others on the tomorrow morning roster. He hadn't needed Stokes to tell him. He'd known that already. That was, after all, why he'd said something, why he'd pushed when Tolliver pushed back, why he'd stood in that cold magazine and insisted on being heard, which was not something that came naturally to him, not anymore. You did it because 5 people were going to walk into a magazine at 7 in the morning and spend their shift breathing air that would put them in the hospital, and because no machine in that facility was going to tell them that, and because you were the one standing there who knew. That was all. The kettle came to a boil. He made his tea. He sat at the kitchen table and drank it slowly, in the quiet of the house, in no hurry to be anywhere, with the windows dark against the October night and the smell of the garden, cold soil, late season, the particular exhaled breath of a vegetable bed putting itself to sleep, just barely coming through the gap in the window frame he'd been meaning to weather strip since all. He thought about the tomatoes. He'd done particularly well with the brandywines this year. There were still a dozen of the last ones in a paper bag on the counter, pulled green before the frost and left to ripen slowly. He'd probably need to use them by the weekend. He finished his tea, washed the cup, and left it in the drying rack. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed.